Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson. I'm your host. And for the next, almost half hour, I'm going to be rattling away about several things that I think are important, think worthy of your notice and attention. If you have any reactions to the show, as always, you can send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, WHOVIATING @AOL.com. And if you didn't catch that, you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here several times during the show. You can go there, you can get the email address from there, or if you prefer, you can leave a comment there. If you do send me email, two requests, as always, again. One is to include something in the subject line to make it clear this is not spam, of which, like everybody, I get way too much, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I'm just terrible about answering email. So, with that, let's get to it. We're going to start with some good news this week. Now, I have in the past talked about the ongoing outrage of what is politely called civil asset forfeiture, and more accurately called cops legally stealing your stuff in order to pad their own budgets. I first brought this up nearly 2 years ago on this show, and brought it up most recently about 7 or 8 weeks ago, I guess it was. Now, I described and do describe civil asset forfeiture as a corrupted and corruption-driven outgrowth of the so-called war on drugs. The process allows the police to seize assets, money, cars, businesses, your house, anything, to seize assets based on nothing more than their claimed belief that this is involved in the drug trade or was purchased with proceeds from the drug trade. They can do this even if they have no basis for any charges against the person whose stuff is being taken. They are not required to present any actual evidence that this stuff actually was in some way connected to the drug trade. And once an asset is seized, it becomes the responsibility of the person whose stuff was taken to prove that this asset was not obtained through the drug trade, which means they have to prove a negative, and the burden of proof is on them in doing it. The use of civil asset forfeiture exploded after the passage of the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which included a provision under which proceeds from civil asset forfeiture no longer went to the general fund. It went to the budgets of whatever police departments actually were involved in the seizure. In other words, this provision now gave police a profit motive for taking your stuff. The result at the federal level was for proceeds from civil asset forfeiture going from $27 million in 1985 to $556 million in 1993 to $4.2 billion in 2012. Now, there seems to be a slowly rising, too slowly, but rising, sense of outrage about this as the practice has begun to attract some attention. And when people realize what this is about, they tend to be a little miffed, let's say. One particular bit of good news this week in this regard is that U.S. District Judge James Gritzner in Iowa has refused to dismiss a lawsuit brought against two local Iowa cops who seized $100,000 from two men driving through Iowa on their way home to California. It was in April 2013, and the two men were William Davis and John Numerzitsky. They were returning home from a World Series of Poker event. They were pulled over by the cops, who basically intimidated and manipulated them into allowing a voluntary search of their car. The search turned up the money and a small amount of marijuana, which for the cops was more than enough justification to simply take the money. Now, the two ultimately got $90,000 of that money back and are now suing the two cops to get back some of the money that they had to spend in order to get their money back. As part of this, they're also suing a company called Desert Snow, which advises cops on how to do these kind of roadside stops and seizures, including advising them to do things like target cars with out-of-state license plates. Now that suit that these two men have put in place, that suit is what Judge Gritzner said can continue. Now, this doesn't mean that Davis and Numerzhitsky will win their suit, although I certainly hope they do. But it is another small indication of shifting of sentiment away from the idea that police can steal your stuff without any consequences. And yeah, that is good news. All right, another bit of good news comes from another court. This one, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, which ruled on July 14th that a Catholic order of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor, which runs about 30 nursing homes around the country, must comply with the Affordable Care Act and allow their employees to obtain contraception coverage through a third-party insurer. The Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, requires most employers other than houses of worship to cover the full range of contraceptive care in their health plans at no out-of-pocket cost to the women. Now, because of the right-wing screeching about the horrible, terrible birth control involved, and I will say that we told you a long time ago they were not going to stop at abortion. But because of that screeching, an exemption was written into the healthcare law, allowing religiously based nonprofits such as the Little Sisters to opt out of covering birth control if it's against their religious beliefs. All they have to do is file a form with the federal government saying so. And in those cases, the federal government directs the third-party insurer to cover the costs. Now, the Little Sisters sued over this rule because they said that even filling out that form makes them complicit in providing birth control, even if they don't have to pay for it, even if they don't have to cover it. Put more clearly, they not only wanted to be able to refuse to pay for contraceptive coverage, they not only wanted to refuse to have to cover themselves birth control, they wanted to be able to actively hinder the ability of their employees to obtain contraceptive care by preventing that third-party coverage requirement from kicking in. Well, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals knocked that down, ruling that the accommodation carved out for groups such as the Little Sisters, quote, is as easy as obtaining a parade permit, filing a simple tax form, or registering to vote. In fact, it may actually be easier than those last two, since there's no requirement for you to show how providing birth control violates your religious beliefs. All you have to do is say it does. Now, what's more, the court found this requirement to file the form, quoting the court, does not substantially burden their religious exercise under RFRA, which is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or infringe on their First Amendment rights. The cost of the suit is being borne by a legal outfit called the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, whose concept of religious liberty is pretty much for both businesses and individuals to be able to discriminate against anyone they want and ignore any laws they don't like, as long as they just say, God said so. In response to the ruling, Mark Rienzi, who's senior counsel at this fund, claimed it was a case of, and I'm quoting him, the world's most powerful government insisting that it must crush the Little Sisters' faith, which surely ranks as among the most hyperbolic statements of recent times. Or maybe it was just the frustrated rage of a loser. In either case, this blow against the increasingly argued notion that invoking God automatically frees you from any legal or social obligations, that's good news. And one last bit of good news for this week. 2 weeks ago, I gave a hero award to the Girl Scouts of America for their announcement that the group would accept transgender girls, and for the subsequent return by one chapter of a donation of $100,000, which was given under the condition that it not be used for the benefit of transgender girls. Now, at that time, I noted that the Boy Scouts of America continued to, quoting myself, struggle, fuss, and fume, trying to come up with policies that are sufficiently non-discriminatory to get out from under the criticism it's facing without actually having to be non-discriminatory. Well, guess what? I may have spoken a bit too quickly. On July 13th, the Executive Committee of the Boy Scouts of America announced that it had unanimously approved a resolution that would end the group's blanket ban on gay scout leaders, and they would let individual scout units have their own policies on the matter. It'll become official policy if ratified by the organization's 80-member National Executive Board at a meeting on July 27th. Now, this move is far from perfect, as by its nature, it continues to allow individual scout units to discriminate, a move no doubt made to accommodate groups such as the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, which sponsor large numbers of scouting units. And it's also worth noting that this change of heart comes only after a number of local scout units had openly adopted policies saying that they would accept scout leaders without regard to sexual orientation. In other words, openly defying the national ban on the issue. Still, when we recall that it wasn't until January 2014 that the Boy Scouts allowed openly gay youth in the group, even as it continued the ban on gay scout leaders, we can agree with Eagle Scout Zach Walls, who's the leader of a group called Scouts for Equality. And he said, and I'm quoting, "While this policy change is not perfect, it is difficult to overstate the importance of today's announcement. Put another way, it's good news." All right, keeping up the upbeat portion of the show, we have a Hero Award this week. This is something we give out here occasionally as the cause arises for someone, some group, some whatever that just does the right thing on a matter big or small. In June, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill allowing gun owners who had previously qualified for concealed carry permits to carry their handguns openly in waist or shoulder holsters. In other words, to walk around here, there, everywhere, openly packing heat, and you better not rile me, boy. The law will go into effect in January. Well, on July 2nd, the CEO of a Texas-based hamburger chain called Whataburger issued a statement saying the chain will continue its policy of prohibiting customers from openly carrying guns in its restaurants. Now, Whataburger is described as a cult favorite. It's got about 780 stores spread over 10 states. And its CEO, Preston Atkinson, said the company has to think about how open carry impacts our employees and customers, with many of them saying that they are uncomfortable being around someone with a visible firearm who's not a member of law enforcement. Which would seem to be a reasonable, even a very moderate thing to say, but of course the gun nuts are up in arms, if you'll pardon the expression. They're issuing denunciations and threatening boycotts. In his announcement, Atkinson insisted that the decision to maintain the ban, despite the new law, was actually a business decision, not a political one. And in fact, the company has stayed out of the maelstrom which has erupted on its Facebook page, limiting its own official posts to subjects like root beer floats. So perhaps it was just a business decision. But the company had to know that doing it, especially in Texas, would get them a lot of flack and potentially cost them customers, at least among the my gun's bigger than your gun crowd. And they did it anyway. And in fact, by continuing this prohibition of open carry of guns, they've actually gone beyond what some other chains have done, such as Chipotle and Starbucks, who only requested that their customers not carry guns into their stores. So maybe it was a business decision, but it was still the right thing to do, and it gets Whataburger a Hero Award. Now, however, as a footnote to that, I have to note something. The article about Whataburger quotes Shannon Watts. She's the founder of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense. And she said, I'm quoting her, "Just like many members of Moms Demand Action, Whataburger's president and CEO is a gun owner who supports and promotes responsible gun ownership and who knows that support for the Second Amendment can go hand in hand with good business practices." Now, I have to tell you, I am getting thoroughly disgusted, thoroughly sick and tired of it seeming like every expression of even in favor of even the most limited, the most feeble forms of gun control have to be prefaced with some version of, well, I'm a gun owner. I support the Second Amendment. I love guns. I really do. It's as if, to take that back, no, it is that you have to adopt the gun nuts terms, adopt the gun nuts attitudes, that you have to be a gun lover before you can be allowed to speak on the issue, that you have to declare yourself almost totally on the side of the gun nuts before you can say, but I do have this one tiny little difference of opinion. When are we going to learn that you can't fight an opponent by adopting that opponent's terms of how the fight is to be fought? Why do we keep acting like we have to endorse, we have to embrace the worldview of the nutsoid rabbit brains of America, the NRA? Why do we have to act like we have to endorse this when recent studies by both the biannual General Social Survey and the Gallup poll have revealed that gun ownership is a minority position in this country? Fewer than half of U.S. households have a gun, and that number has been steadily declining for several years. We all know the reason. Political cowardice. Which is why, and it's the only reason why, moves to end the carnage never seem to get anywhere. We're going to take a break. And we're back. And we're back with one of our regular features. It's the Outrage of the Week. 5 weeks ago, I noted that in the version of Fast Track Authority on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Senate passed, there is a provision that would bar any country engaging in human trafficking, that is the slave trade, from benefiting from the trade deal. Human Rights Watch said it was incomprehensible that anyone could be against this provision, but someone was, the Obama administration. Why? Because one of the 12 countries involved in the still secret negotiations going on about the Trans-Pacific Partnership is Malaysia, which our own State Department considers to be among the worst offenders, home of some of the worst abuses in slavery. The White House said that in blocking Malaysia from the trade deal, that could bring the whole thing down, so they wanted this provision out. As I said at the time, this means the O-Gang is so intent on scoring this deal for the transnational corporations and the trade banks that will be the primary beneficiaries that it is fully prepared to even in effect argue for allowing Malaysia to continue active involvement in the international slave trade. It appeared to me to be moral bankruptcy in its purest form. Until now. You see, the version of Fast Track Authority that ultimately passed Congress watered down the provision about human trafficking somewhat, but it was still there. It still said that any nation listed by the State Department as Tier 3, that is the category of the worst offenders on human trafficking, that countries listed in Tier 3 could not get trade benefits. Malaysia is in Tier 3. But now, according to multiple sources, the State Department's new report on human trafficking, which is due out this week, will upgrade Malaysia to Tier 2. Now, Malaysia was dropped to Tier 3 just last year because of, among other things, an extensive sex slave industry, widespread forced labor in the country's electronics and palm oil industries, and official corruption involving profiting from human trafficking. Human rights advocates had expected Malaysia to remain at Tier 3, given its slow pace of convictions in human trafficking cases and the continued pervasive forced labor. In other words, they expected it to remain in Tier 3 because essentially very little had changed. In fact, as recently as April, the U.S. ambassador to Malaysia called on the country to take the prosecution of human traffickers more seriously. And in May, just as the amazing Mr. O was cranking up his efforts to get fast-tracked through the Senate, Malaysian police announced the discovery of 139 graves in jungle camps used by suspected smugglers and traffickers near the border with Burma. Despite all that, the State Department is expected to move Malaysia up to Tier 2, which means, wait, guess what? Oh, hooray, hooray! Isn't this a wonderful surprise? Malaysia can now be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the deal remains on track. As Phil Oakes used to say, thank God for coincidence. Representatives of human rights groups, and at least some in Congress, say that, in the words of Human Rights Watch, moving Malaysia to Tier 2 would be, quote, a decision so extraordinarily unwarranted that political interference can be presumed. The depths of moral corruption to which this administration will sink in order to do the bidding of the banks is almost incomprehensible. It is an utter outrage. All right, next up, I was actually thinking of doing a whole big thing on the Greece fiscal crisis, because I'm sure you've heard about this, but I decided to put it off because, frankly, doing it properly would take up the entire show. So I'm just going to limit myself to this right now. It should come as no surprise to anyone that the coverage by the American mass media of this has been just dreadful. It is presented with essentially no context or background. It is focused almost entirely on a combination of personalities, in particular Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who is presented as either a fire-breathing leftist radical or an incompetent loose cannon, and often enough both. And on a version of the horse race coverage, so beloved by the American media because it gives the impression of being informative without actually requiring a great deal of work. In this case, going on and on about who has the upper hand in negotiations. You want to know how bad this is? Let me tell you about this. I'm sure you know that the overall issue is economic support for Greece, which was hit harder than most of the rest of the Europe when the world economy cratered back in 2008. Well, on July 6th, in the wake of Greece's referendum on austerity, the Washington Post reported that, quoting, that the Prime Minister, quoting, also is expected to present new proposals to a tough audience, seeking to persuade European partners that Greece can be trusted to trim its spending. Trim its spending. As a condition for previous aid, Greece has been forced into a program of severe austerity imposed by the European Union and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Between 2010 and 2015, 5-year period, Greece cut government spending by 23%. In addition to cutting government spending, it cut salaries, slashed pensions, privatized and deregulated, and raised taxes, all based on the demands of the EU and the IMF, with the entirely predictable result that the economy sank into an even deeper hole. Unemployment in Greece has been stuck above 25% since the end of 2012. 40% of Grecian children now live in poverty. Infant mortality is skyrocketing, and youth unemployment is estimated at 50%. And when austerity fails, as it always does, as it did in the case of Greece, when it only leaves the victim in a downward-sucking whirlpool of ever greater debt, the answer for such struggling nations is always the same, and it's the answer that has now been given to Greece: more austerity. And we have this new deal announced on July 13th. This new deal between Greece and the European Union, described by Reuters as, quoting, Eurozone leaders making Greece surrender much of its sovereignty to outside supervision in return for agreeing to talks on an $86 billion euro bailout. And I want you to note, and know quite well, this agreement is not a bailout, it's agreeing to talks on a bailout. Greece is on its knees, and instead of helping it up, the European Union, particularly German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who seems to be the real hardliner on this, Europe is beating it with a club. Every provision, every sentence, every line, every word, every punctuation mark in this so-called deal, this economic terrorism, has one overriding purpose. See to it that, at least in the long run, at least at the end of it all, ultimately, the banks get paid. And whatever suffering actual people have to go through to achieve that end is just not important. In fact, the conditions the European Union is putting on Greece now are so onerous that even the IMF is saying that they are too harsh and that any new deal has to include significant debt relief for Greece. That is, some of that indebtedness should just be written off. And if it's not, the IMF won't take part in the deal. That's what's happened. That's what's been going on. That's what's been done to Greece. It has been pushed into the worst depression seen in Europe since the early 1930s. But what does one of the leading American newspapers wonder? Can Greece trim its spending? What a waste our media is. It's no surprise that the average American has such a limited knowledge and understanding of the world around them. All right, finally for this week, Iran. The deal with Iran. And Frank, I have to tell you, I'm in an odd position to comment on the deal with Iran because the whole business was and is premised on the claim that Iran was trying to build nuclear weapons, that in fact it's on the verge of doing so and has been prevented from doing that only by constant pressure. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been peddling that line since 1993, when he claimed that Iran would have nukes in 3 to 5 years, which would make them 18 to 20 years overdue now. He continues to make the same claim. Iran is inches away from having nukes, even when his own intelligence services told him otherwise. In fact, the Christian Science Monitor came up with warnings about Iranian nuclear weapons dating back to the late 1970s, a time when the Shah was still in power. This has been so consistent over so long that a while back I joked that the old riddle, what is it that is always coming but never arrives, now has two answers: tomorrow and Iranian nuclear weapons. So I'm in a funny position to comment because I was never convinced that the central conceit driving the entire sanctions negotiations regime, that Iran was actively trying to build a nuclear weapon, was even true. So to me, the negotiations actually appeared to be a group of mostly Western nations bullying Iran over its nuclear program without having actually any hard evidence that nuclear was intended to be an adjective for weapons rather than energy. Bullying which, in fact, if it was directed against us, we would regard as the grossest affront to our national interests and rights, and there would be daily calls for war. But in a way that doesn't matter now, because we're sort of between the proverbial rock and the hard place, and that the failure of these negotiations would have significantly increased the risk of a war on Iran, which is actually what a number of the agreement's opponents, including Israel, actually want the U.S. to do. So the success of negotiations was clearly the better, or more precisely, less bad option, and so have to be glad for what is accomplished, and to say, I don't say it much, so cherish it, congratulations to Barack Obama. The right wing, of course, is frothing with fury and full of predictions of catastrophe for the U.S. or Israel or the world in some order or combination, none of which will come true unless they succeed in blocking the agreement, which would be likely to make Iranian leaders think, hey, maybe we better get a bomb because these people would be crazy, which would really ratchet up the prospects of bloody war of the sort the right wing has long wanted. Asked his reaction to the New Deal, House Majority Leader John Boehner, Sir John of Orange, said, "No deal is better than a bad deal." In at least this case, that's not true. Even if this was a bad deal, which actually is, considering it amounts to imperialist bullying, but even if it was a bad deal in the sense that our leaders and pundits usually mean it, still it is better than no deal. And let's just hope that enough people in Congress realize that and don't block it. That's it. I'm done. We're out of here. You have the best week you possibly can. We will see you here next week. Peace.